Thanks, Andy. Uh, just quick, wanted to kind of offer a little background. NEWMOA is an organization of waste management officials from the New England states, New York, and New Jersey. And we had some discussions, and all the states had been encountering issues with the management of remediation waste that led us to the conclusion that we needed to do more outreach and education on that topic. So that's really why this webinar series was conceived and why it's being presented. And originally we had it in mind for either folks in hazardous waste programs or remediation programs in the NEWMOA states or private sector folks in the NEWMOA states, but a lot of interest has been generated apparently all around the country, and word has gotten out. So we have folks listening in, I guess, from as far-flung places as Hawaii and other states outside of the NEWMOA area. So we're glad to have you aboard. It seems as though the issue of how to manage remediation waste properly under RCRA is not an issue that's limited to the Northeast states, but is an issue that I think a lot of states are thinking about. So that's why we're here today. All right. So as Andy mentioned, this is the first, or this is the third of several webinars, and we've sort of taken a progressive approach to these webinars, and leading up to the fourth webinar next month. And what we've already covered includes topics such as the characterization of contaminated environmental media. And I'll just note that when I use the word media throughout this presentation, I'm talking about soil, sediment, and surface or groundwater. I'm not talking about other types of remediation-derived waste necessarily, but they certainly are an issue, and I will touch on them later. We also talked about the point of generation. The point of generation defines when a waste or contaminated environmental media first becomes subject to regulation as a hazardous waste. And for most contaminated environmental media, the point of generation occurs when the waste is, quote, actively managed. In simple terms, active management means that the media is picked up or removed from the area of contamination that it was formerly in. However, if the waste that caused the contamination was already a hazardous waste when it was disposed of, spilled, or released, such as a recent spill, for example, then the point of generation has already occurred and the waste is already hazardous. Another important topic or concept that we talked about in previous webinars is the very important responsibility of a generator to perform a hazardous waste determination on any media that they may be generating during a remediation project. A third item is a discussion about characteristic versus listed hazardous waste. We also talked about what's called the contained-in principle for listed hazardous waste. This, just briefly stated, and I'll just note that all of these topics and the slides for the previous webinars are all on the NEWMOA website, and I have links for them later. And the slides from this website, this webinar will also be presented on the NEWMOA website, so you'll have access to those links and that information. But the contained-in principle basically says that media, i.e. soil, sediment, ground or surface water that contains a listed hazardous waste is itself regulated as a listed hazardous waste. That's a very important principle because it loops in a lot of media into REC regulation at sites where listed hazardous wastes were released or spilled or disposed of. We also discussed exemptions for certain types of environmental media from hazardous waste requirements. We talked about the contained-in policy, and that's important to distinguish from the contained-in principle. The contained-in principle, as I just discussed, is the principle that says that media contaminated with listed waste is itself a listed waste. The contained-in policy is an EPA policy that says that contaminated media can be deemed not to be a listed hazardous waste if it meets certain health-based criteria. And the EPA policy allows states to come up with their own state-specific contained-in policies that reference their own relevant health-based standards. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. Another important concept was the area of contamination policy. This is an EPA policy that identifies certain types of limited activities that can occur within the area of contamination. And I'll just note here, when I use that abbreviation AOC, that may be an abbreviation that some of you are familiar with in the remedial context, and this is a little bit different use of that term. The term AOC, as used in this presentation, is different from, say, area of concern that's commonly used in remedial context, and I'll define that a little better in a couple of slides. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about really on-site management of wastes at remedial sites, including on-site storage, in particular the types of units that can and cannot be used for storage of media, particularly hazardous media. We'll also talk about on-site treatment and the types of units that can be used for on-site treatment without a permit under RCRA, and certain exemptions that exist from permitting for treatment, and again, what's allowed and what's not allowed in the way of treatment of hazardous media at remedial sites. We'll also talk with the very important responsibility of a generator to comply with the relevant hazardous waste generator requirements while they are managing hazardous debris on site. And we'll also touch on some other on-site waste management issues that can come up at cleanup sites. First, I wanted to revisit in a little more detail the item that I mentioned before, this area of contamination policy. The area of contamination policy, and anywhere in this presentation where you note that the text is yellow and underlined, that means that it's a live link. So when you get the slides for this presentation, you want to learn more about a particular topic, you can click on those to get that information. At any rate, the area of contamination policy is an EPA policy that's supported by most of the NEWMOA states, and to my knowledge, with most of the states across the country. Again, an area of contamination is a little bit different than you may typically think of if you typically work in the remedial context. Within the area of contamination policy, AOC means a single contiguous area of continuous contamination, such as you see in the lower right-hand picture. And this policy allows certain activities to occur within the AOC without triggering generation of the waste as a hazardous waste and without triggering the associated RCRA treatment and LDR requirements. And those activities include consolidation of waste within the AOC, so moving it around, moving it from one end or one side of the AOC to the other, say for live loading into vehicles or for other purposes. And it also allows in situ treatment within the AOC. So the AOC policy allows both of these things to occur without the waste being generated and subject to RCRA requirements. It does not cover or allow movement of waste outside of the AOC. So as soon as the waste goes outside of the AOC, it's subject to full RCRA regulation. It also doesn't cover movement of waste between AOCs. So if a waste is moved from one discrete area of contamination to another, it's generated as a waste and must be managed under RCRA requirements. It also doesn't allow ex situ treatment. So if you wanted to dig up contaminated soil within an AOC and put it in some sort of a mobile soil treatment device, that would not be allowed under the AOC policy. We'll discuss in a little while other ways in which that kind of ex situ treatment could be allowed. All right, so moving right on to the topic of storage, on-site storage of hazardous waste media. What can you do without a hazardous waste permit? In other words, what can you do under generator requirements only? And keep in mind, we're talking here about hazardous media, media contaminated with hazardous waste where that exhibits a characteristic of hazardous waste. One thing you can do, as we just alluded to, is storage within the AOC under the AOC policy. And there is a particular application of this policy that is documented in a particular EPA letter. EPA for the RCRA program has a repository for a bunch of policy interpretation letters, and it's called RCRA Online. And the documents are given what's called an RO, or RCRA Online number. So RCRA Online number 11671, that document talks about the AOC policy basically as it applies to utility trench excavation. So that it basically says that if you're excavating for the purposes of installing or replacing utilities or something of that nature, and you're placing the soil next to the utility trench excavation temporarily, and then backfilling it, that does not constitute generation of waste under the AOC policy and doesn't trigger RCRA requirements. Some states may not adopt that provision, and some states like New Jersey, and I believe Martin, our next presenter, will actually talk about that in a little more detail, have very specific policies on this issue. So be aware of that. Another thing that's allowed with respect to storage outside the AOC, it can occur in containers or tanks under the hazardous waste generator requirements, and you see a link there for the generator requirements. And to kind of just cover quickly, A, what we're talking about when we talk about containers and tanks, and B, some of the applicable requirements. The difference between a tank and a container, as defined in 40 CFR 260.10, is that basically containers are portable and tanks are stationary. That's the chief difference between the two. Something could be very large and be a container, such as the dumpster in the upper right-hand picture. Something could be quite small and be a tank if it's fixed or stationary. And the requirements are significantly different between the two for containers and tanks. So that's an important distinction to make. The generator requirements that apply to containers and tanks include the actual management of the containers or tanks, things like their design, their labeling, their marking, how long they can be accumulated on site, and so forth. But also certain administrative requirements for generators, such as personnel training, contingency plans and emergency response, and so forth. There are also special requirements for things called satellite containers. These are containers that are at or near the point of generation where waste initially accumulate and that are under the control of the operator of the process that generates the waste. Satellite containers are typically intended for use in industry where you may have a production floor where there are numerous points of waste generation, and there's a need to temporarily store waste before putting it in a permanent container. But it can also apply to remediation sites. And as noted in this particular RCRA Online document, a very large container, such as a roll-off, could be utilized as a satellite container, even though the satellite containers only allow storage up to 55 gallons. They also allow, or require, I should say, the waste to be, quote unquote, fully managed in compliance with hazardous waste requirements once they become full within 3 days. So conceivably, if, for example, you had a roll-off that was next to an area of excavation, you could manage that roll-off as a satellite container for up to 3 days in excess of 55 gallons, as documented in that RCRA Online document. This may or may not be the interpretation of your state, so check with that, but that is a management option that some states have allowed, and it can make things more convenient because there are fewer requirements for satellite containers than for fully regulated containers. Another option is for generators is containment buildings. And containment buildings are a very particular kind of unit that are subject not only to the requirements in Section 262 of the federal regs, but also some special requirements in 40 CFR 265 subpart DD, and there's a link for that there. And I'll just note here that these references that I have to the federal regulations may not apply in your state. You can use them as general references because states can't be any less stringent than the federal regs, but just be advised that your state may have more stringent or slightly different requirements for a lot of these different provisions. A containment building, basically, as the name implies, is a building. It could be a temporary building, or it could utilize an existing building on the site that is used to store waste, for example, in piles or in tanks or containers within the building. And it offers better options for the management of media than containers or tanks do. So they can be a great option at remedial sites. Basically, those three types of containers, with some exceptions I'll talk about in a minute, are the only types of devices that generators are allowed to store hazardous waste, including hazardous waste media, in without a permit. If a generator wants to use another type of unit, they would need to have a permit. Again, with some exceptions that I'll describe in a little while. Moving on. One of those types of units that could potentially be utilized by a generator site is what's called corrective action units. And there are three different kinds of corrective action units. These are specific to corrective action sites, and which oftentimes have a RCRA permit, but sometimes don't. And in cases where they don't, they would be operating primarily under generator requirements. These RCRA corrective action units have to be specifically approved by EPA or a state that's authorized to run the corrective action program. They're typically approved via either a RCRA permit, a closure plan, an order, or a remedial action plan. A remedial action plan is a specific type of device that is discussed and provided for in the corrective action regulations for cleaning up a corrective action site. And those approvals, regardless of whether they're in the form of a permit or a closure plan or an order or whatever, include specific requirements for the design, the operation, and the closure of these units. And then, as I said, there are three of them. The first type of unit is called a corrective action unit, corrective action management unit, or CAMU. And these are allowed for the management only of what are referred to as CAMU eligible wastes. And those are defined in the federal regulations at 40 CFR 264.552A. Provided it's one of those CAMU eligible wastes, then a CAMU can be approved for any of a wide variety of types of units for storage or treatment of remediation waste. So these allow for a lot of flexibility and a lot of different both technologically and financially feasible options for the management of remedial waste or media. Second type of unit is a temporary unit. Temporary units are different from CAMUs in that they are limited to tanks and containers used for the storage or treatment of hazardous media or remediation waste. And these have a limit of 1 year for use. That can be extended in certain specified circumstances, but typically it's 1 year. The third type of unit is called a staging pile. And these are used primarily for the storage of remediation wastes. However, they can also be used for certain other limited activities, such as mixing, sizing, blending, and other physical operations, but they cannot be used for treatment. Also, the rules prohibit them from being used for the storage of ignitable or reactive wastes. Staging piles can be approved for up to 2 years, and again, that is extendable in certain specified circumstances. And to kind of wrap up this section on corrective action, these three different types of units that are allowed under corrective action, if you have questions about their design or how to get them approved, you should contact your state corrective action staff or your EPA corrective action site lead. Each state in the country has, in some cases it's multiple states together, but has a corrective action lead that can provide technical assistance on corrective action issues. Okay, so on-site storage, what kinds of things are not allowed without a permit? The first, and the one that I would like to stress the most here, is storage in ordinary waste piles outside the AOC. And what do I mean by an ordinary waste pile? I mean a waste pile that is not a quote-unquote staging pile that's been approved under the corrective action requirements. And why not? You know, I hear this question a lot from folks that are in the remedial profession. You know, I've been doing that for years with contaminated environmental media. If it's hazardous media, why can't I store it in a pile temporarily while it's being tested? And there are a lot of reasons for that. For one, the hazardous waste media really is not effectively contained when it's in a pile. As a result, it's exposed to sun, wind, rain, and all of this facilitates releases of the media and the hazardous waste constituents in the media to the environment. And even if you take efforts to place the pile on plastic and cover it with plastic, put sandbags down to keep the plastic in place, it just really seems that despite all these efforts, exposure to the elements eventually tears the plastic away, and they tend to become exposed, releasing constituents into the environment. And it's exactly that reason why waste piles are only allowed in certain circumstances, i.e. under a RCRA Part B permit, or as an approved staging pile under the corrective action requirements, and why they should not be used to store hazardous media. Another thing I want to throw out on this issue of storage, because I've seen increasing use of geotubes, and for those of you who may not be familiar with them, geotubes come in a variety of sizes, and the smaller ones, think of, they look kind of like a fire hose, because they're like a woven material with fixtures on either end. And the woven material is specifically designed to be porous and allow water out, but keep sediment inside. So they're very good for dewatering sediment or soil that has been excavated below the groundwater table. The problem with geotubes is that they're not really a RCRA generator unit, which is to say they're not really a tank or a container. First of all, they're not designed to contain anything. They're by design intended to leak water specifically. So they can't be operated or used as RCRA tanks or containers under RCRA generator requirements. However, they can be managed within a RCRA generator unit. For example, they could be managed within a tank that was designed to collect the accumulated liquid and manage it accordingly. We'll touch on geotubes again later on in the treatment section, because I have some thoughts about that as well. Now we're moving on to treatment. We're going to go over some general principles first. One thing to know about RCRA, if you don't already, is that as a general rule, under RCRA, treatment of hazardous waste requires a hazardous waste permit, Part B permit, or a TSDF permit, we refer to it as. However, there are some exceptions to the general rule that we'll go over here in a minute. And even if treatment is allowed under one of these exceptions without a permit, it's important to keep in mind that there could be other permit requirements that may apply. In particular, state permitting requirements. For example, here in Connecticut, we have companies that do mobile soil treatment of both hazardous and non-hazardous waste, hazardous under an exemption, non-hazardous under our state requirements. But in both cases, they require a permit from us if they're doing it commercially. Another potential factor is Clean Water Act permits. That might be appropriate, for example, in a groundwater pump and treat system. And the last example would be air permits, Clean Air Act permits, for things such as soil venting, running through GAC filters, depending on the amount of volatiles and potential emissions in tons per year. Okay, so let's get into the specifics of treatment on site. One form of treatment that a generator can engage in on site is, as I mentioned before, in situ treatment within the AOC. An example of this would be, for example, as I just alluded to, soil venting with GAC filtration. Another would be injection of bioremediation agents. As you see there in the picture in the upper right-hand corner, oftentimes these agents are injected either into contaminated soil or groundwater. The microbes and the nutrients that are injected facilitate the breakdown of the contaminants, and there may be a withdrawal or pumping associated with that. But that kind of in situ treatment within the AOC would not be regulated such that it would require a permit. Another option is treatment in containers, tanks, or containment buildings under the so-called generator treatment interpretation. And again, this is an EPA interpretation. You should check with your state to see if it's applicable in your state or if your state has more specific requirements. But basically, EPA has said that generators can not just store waste in tanks, containers, or containment buildings, but also engage in treatment in tanks, containers, or containment buildings with some limitations. And I'll get to that in a second. So an example of treatment in tanks, containers, or containment buildings that would be allowed would be, for example, soil stabilization of contaminated soil in a roll-off container. The limitation that I mentioned is that generators can only engage in chemical or physical treatment in tanks or containers or containment buildings. They can't conduct thermal treatment, such as incineration, thermal desorption, or other thermal types of treatment without a permit under the hazardous waste treatment in generator tanks or containers policy. Okay, what else do we have? The RCRA regulations provide an exemption from permitting requirements for wastewater treatment units and elementary neutralization units. Both of these types of units, and they're different, are defined in the hazardous waste regulations in section 260.10 and can be used by generators to treat wastewaters that might otherwise be hazardous and render them non-hazardous. The wastewater or treatment unit exemption is conditioned upon the wastewater treatment unit meeting the definition of a wastewater treatment unit in 260.10, which is, among other things, that it must be a tank. That's the biggest part. There's also a Clean Water Act element to it. Elementary neutralization units, on the other hand, can be either a container or a tank. And in both cases, the exemption exempts the unit from RCRA regulation. However, I would note, but before I go there, an example of these two exemptions would be a groundwater pump and treat system that's operated under the Clean Water Act permit. That would be an example of the wastewater treatment unit exemption. The caution I wanted to note is that the wastewater treatment unit exemption only exempts the unit. It does not exempt the entire treatment process or facility. So, for example, in the upper right-hand corner, you see a very large mobile wastewater treatment system that was installed at a remedial site in Connecticut that was used to treat sediment that was pulled out of a river. It dewatered that sediment through the large clarifiers you see in the middle of the picture. The supernatant wastewater was further clarified in the bank of tanks that you see, the bank of filter tanks you see on the left, and the sediment was further dewatered until basically it was in a semi-dry state and could be managed and removed from the site. And the wastewater treatment unit exemption does apply to the clarifiers in the center and the filters on the left, but if they were, for example, at some point to put the sediment into roll-offs, at this site they did not do that, but if they were to do that, then the material, which in this case, at least some of it did test out hazardous, would not be exempt. So the wastewater treatment unit exemption does not exempt the entire site because it has a wastewater treatment facility on it that's permitted under the Clean Water Act, but it does exempt any units associated with that treatment system, but not any units outside of the system. And here's where I get back to geotubes. Geotubes do not qualify as wastewater treatment units in their own right because they don't meet the definition of a tank. However, they can be managed within a wastewater treatment unit, such as a tank. They can also be used in other ways, such as in corrective action management units or permitted units, if they are going to be used to treat hazardous waste. Another way a generator can use or can engage in treatment at a site is by using the corrective action management units that I mentioned earlier, or temporary units or staging piles, or not staging piles, I should say. Staging piles cannot be used for treatment. And again, that requires a special approval, but can technically be done by a site outside of a permit. There's also a specific exemption in RCRA for spill response actions, and there's another provision for emergency permits. Although technically that is a permit, it's nothing close to a RCRA permit, which, if any of you have ever seen one, is very long and detailed and typically takes longer than a year to from start to finish to issue. Emergency permits can be drafted and issued very quickly and address emergency situations such as the removal of an explosive or otherwise hazardous waste that poses an immediate risk. What's not allowed without a permit? Well, treatment of waste piles outside the AOC, unless that's approved by a CAMU. And the reasons why are, first of all, it constitutes ex situ treatment, which we've said you can't do outside the AOC without a permit already under the AOC policy. And secondly, a waste pile is not a unit generator is allowed to operate under generator requirements in the first place. I should note that this specifically includes the activity often referred to as windrowing, which is commonly used for bioremediation of soils. Just keep that in mind. And another thing that's not allowed without a permit is any sort of thermal treatment, which again includes incineration or thermal desorption. Next thing I wanted to talk about to kind of tie in what we've talked about in the previous webinars is the concept of contained in determinations and how that interplays with on-site management decisions. So to revisit the prior webinars, a contained in determination, again, is done under the contained in policy, and it's when you have a media that contains a listed hazardous waste, and that media is found to have concentrations of the listed hazardous waste constituents below health-based standards specified in the relevant states or EPA's contained in policy, then it's determined not to be a listed hazardous waste. And at that point in time, when the determination is made, the material is no longer hazardous waste and no longer subject to RCRA. And the timing of these determinations is very important, again, with respect to on-site management decisions. In particular, because the contained in determination affects the point of generation, if you make the contained in determination that a material is not a listed hazardous waste before the point of generation, then RCRA storage and retreatment requirements don't apply to the material, and LDR standards may or may not apply depending on whether the waste is pre-RCRA or post-RCRA. And we talked about this before in a prior webinar, but just to explain quickly, if a waste was disposed of, spilled, or released prior to the effective date of RCRA for that particular waste, which in most cases is November 1980, then it pre-exists RCRA. And EPA's interpretation is that a waste that was spilled or disposed of or released before the effective date of RCRA is not a waste until it is removed from storage or disposal, which is to say it's picked up or it's generated. So if you make the contained in determination prior to it being generated and it's a pre-RCRA waste, then the LDR standards don't apply. However, if the waste is a post-RCRA waste, in other words, if it was spilled, released, or disposed of after the effective date of RCRA for that waste, then it is covered by the LDR standards, even though it's not hazardous any longer. And basically, just the reason for that is that two-part, really. EPA didn't want RCRA to be retroactive. So in other words, so much mismanagement of hazardous waste that occurred before RCRA was effective that EPA didn't want its long arm of the RCRA law to reach back into ancient history. But on the other hand, they didn't want to allow spillage and intentional disposal or improper disposal or releases of hazardous waste that occurred after the effective date of RCRA to be released from RCRA requirements. So that's the reason for that distinction. On the other hand, if you make the contained in determination on a media that contains listed hazardous waste after the point of generation, things are very different. In the first place, RCRA storage and treatment requirements apply to the material from the point of generation up until the determination is actually completed. That means samples have been taken, the samples have been analyzed, the results have been determined to meet the policy and are below the health-based criteria. Everywhere between the point of generation and the point that that determination is completed, it has to be managed under RCRA requirements. And secondly, the LDR standards also apply regardless of the date of contamination. And I'll just, because I didn't explain it before, land disposal standards dictate whether or not a particular media can be placed back on the ground and have either technology-based or numerical standards that they must meet before they can be placed back on the ground. And that can include either placement in a hazardous waste landfill, a solid waste landfill, reuse, or use as fill. The other important thing I wanted to talk about is the importance of the responsibility of the generator to comply with hazardous waste generator requirements regarding any hazardous media they have at a remediation site. And the generator of the waste as a hazardous waste is responsible for complying with any and all applicable hazardous waste generator requirements, which I alluded to a bit earlier. But to go into a little more detail, this includes making a hazardous waste determination, which is to say, testing or using other knowledge of the waste to determine whether or not it's hazardous, and if it is hazardous, for which codes, and also whether or not it is subject to or meets LDR requirements. The actual on-site storage and treatment of the waste in tanks or containers or containment buildings, and administrative requirements that apply to generators, such as personnel training requirements, emergency response requirements, the use of the hazardous waste manifest, and for large quantity generators, which, if they generate hazardous waste, most remedial sites are, biennial reports. And just quickly on that point, I'll make a special note of the fact that under RCRA, there are these things called episodic generators. And what an episodic generator is a generator that generates hazardous waste for a short period of time pursuant to a specific project like a cleanup project. So many cleanup sites are episodic generators, and oftentimes episodic large quantity generators. And historically, EPA has said that episodic generators need to comply with the applicable generator requirements for any waste that's generated episodically at a site, even if that site does not have an existing EPA ID number, or even if it has an EPA ID number as a small quantity generator or as a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, also known as a very small quantity generator. Some states have adopted the new generator improvements rule, which slightly changed the requirements, or significantly actually changed the requirements for episodic generators, and require specific notification. In terms of EPA ID number, sites tend to vary a little bit in terms of what they require. If a remedial site is either a small quantity generator or a large quantity generator, it needs to have some sort of EPA ID number to identify the site specifically and to put on the hazardous waste manifest. Some states, such as my state, Connecticut, issue temporary EPA ID numbers for that purpose. Other states will issue a permanent EPA ID number to the site, which means that it will go into the RCRA database permanently. So check with the requirements for your state and make sure that, if your site is going to be generating hazardous waste and shipping it off-site, that you have an EPA ID number in accordance with your state's requirements and you use the hazardous waste manifest. The other important thing to note is that compliance with all these requirements that I've discussed is required beginning right at the point that the waste is generated. So as soon as it's basically picked up, actively managed, put in a container, put in some sort of a treatment device that is allowed to be used by a generator, it's subject to RCRA at that point in time. Another thing I'd like to point out is to explain a little bit the definition of what a generator is. The definition of generator as specified in 40 CFR 260.10 is any, and I underline that, any person by site whose act or process produces hazardous waste, identified or listed as a hazardous waste, or who first causes a waste to become subject to regulation. The important thing about that is the way that definition is written, it can actually apply to more than one entity at a particular site. And EPA refers to these multiple entities as co-generators. So, for example, at a remedial site, you may have a property owner who has nothing to do with the site other than owning it, but is hiring an environmental professional, may be operating under a license if your state requires one. Ours does. And also perhaps a environmental consultant, and possibly also an excavation contractor or a remedial contractor. So you could potentially have multiple people at this site who, by virtue of their activities and the decisions they're making, qualify as a generator of the waste, and therefore are, quote, co-generators. The important thing about this is that EPA has stated that, more than just stated, they put it in the Federal Register, that co-generators at a particular site are, quote, jointly and severally liable, end quote, for compliance with hazardous waste requirements. Jointly and severally liable means that any one of the co-generators or any combination of the co-generators or all of the co-generators could potentially be the subject of enforcement for non-compliance with hazardous waste requirements. However, EPA has also said that if there's a written agreement between the co-generators that specifies which of them is responsible for compliance with a particular hazardous waste requirement, EPA will look to that particular co-generator first in assigning responsibility for any non-compliance. So the takeaway here on this co-generator issue is, even if you don't own the site, even if you don't, quote unquote, own the waste, you still may be a co-generator, and you still may be legally responsible for complying with generator requirements. And it's in your best interest, if there are multiple entities at a site, to have a written agreement that very clearly specifies who's responsible for what. Some other things to think about that I wanted to talk about quickly regarding on-site management at remedial sites. Keep in mind that any reuse of media after treatment as fill, whether on or off-site, may be restricted by state requirements, even if it's no longer hazardous and even if it meets LDR requirements. Many states have requirements that restrict the reuse of treated soil as fill, including the state of Connecticut. You also need to think about contaminants other than hazardous waste contaminants, such as PCBs, asbestos, or non-hazardous waste chemicals. These chemicals or materials may be subject to EPA requirements other than RCRA requirements. For example, TSCA in the case of PCBs, the NESHAPS rules in the case of asbestos, or state requirements in the case of non-hazardous chemicals. Some of them may also be regulated as so-called special waste under state solid waste requirements. And there could be other types of non-media waste generated at cleanup sites, such as remediation-derived waste that is not media, which is to say not soil, sediment, groundwater, or surface water, things like granular activated carbon and other types of filters, personal protective equipment, decon wastewaters, pump and treat wastewaters, things of that nature. If you've got a site that's got an old industrial building on it, you may have things like old product or lab chemicals or other chemicals in the building. There could be tanks or piping or ductwork that have chemical contents that need to be properly managed. And if you're knocking down the building, there could be demolition waste that could contain asbestos or other regulated materials. If there's just one slide in this presentation that you take home and remember for years to come, I hope it's this one. This is the big thing that we in Connecticut stress and that we think should always be in the back of everyone's mind that's involved in the management of a remedial site. And that's that RCRA compliance with RCRA requirements should be an integral part of site remediation design and project management. It's very tempting when you're running a cleanup to focus on the cleanup activities and worry about RCRA compliance later. Let's just dig this junk up, put it in a pile, we'll test it and deal with it later. It's very tempting to do that. However, doing this does allow the law of unintended consequences to kick in, which unfortunately can result in enforcement actions and penalties, and Martin will be talking about that in his part of the presentation. It can result in unexpected needs for approvals or permits that you didn't think you would have to get, all of which can result in unnecessary delays and cost overruns. In addition, you also can miss opportunities to minimize disposal cost, such as by missing out on a contained determination timing issue, such as I discussed earlier. It also has to do with how you plan your on-site soil management and staging, and the timing of it. Whether you do in situ versus ex situ treatment. The in situ treatment can sometimes be more expensive, but if it is something you can do without a permit, or that doesn't result in the generation of a waste, or actually eliminates the waste as a hazardous waste, that creates enormous advantages over ex situ treatment. As a result, we consider it a very important BMP for any group of people that are working on a remedial project, any remedial project team, to consider including a RCRA expert in their design team. This person could be in-house if there's a person with the appropriate skills, or contract it out. In addition, you can always consult with your state or EPA. Here in Connecticut, we have something called a pre-application meeting, which is typically for people applying for fixed facilities, water or air permits, but also we use for large remedial projects where we can bring together folks from the various regulatory programs in our agency to talk about particular requirements or permits they may have to deal with during the project that they're planning early on in the planning stages. This next page I really won't talk about very much, other than just to say that this is a resource for further information. All these are live links where you can get a lot more information about the topics I talked about. I'll just quickly note that this all started with some in-person training that was provided back in May and June of this year, and then has been a series of webinars. The first webinar back in October on waste characterization and listed hazardous waste. The second webinar on area of contamination and contained-in policies. Today's webinar, which is going to be posted later today. And the next webinar, which is on waste treatment and land disposal restrictions, in February. If you have other ideas for topics you'd like us to think about or present in the future, let us know. And that's all for my presentation. Andy, if you want to go right to Martin right away and save questions to the very end, I'm completely fine with that. But otherwise, I'll leave it up to you.
Thanks so much, Ross. Yeah, let's do that. Let's hold questions until the end. That way we can cover everything in one shot. Martin, just turning the controls over to you now. Hopefully the handoff goes smoothly.
There we go.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. Ross's presentation was comprehensive, clear. It's a very important topic. I wish I had him on my side back when I was dealing with these cases initially back in the early 2000s and more recent cases, because this is a complicated topic. It's not a clear cut in RCRA. You have to look at several policies and rules to figure out if you're doing the right thing. So I'll go right into my case studies. I'm presenting 3 case studies. They're real enforcement cases that I've been involved in over the years. The first one deals with a utility company, PSE&G, up here in New Jersey, from a substation construction, in which they generated a fair amount of contaminated soil. The second one was an actual cleanup from an old paint manufacturer that sat where a sports club. It used to be a golf range, used to sit, and they were doing a cleanup without authorization from the department at that time. And my third case that I want to speak about is an electroplater, Kramer plating, in which they were actually doing they actually had a lagoon in which they used, and they stopped using, and they were doing a cleanup while I was doing an inspection. I saw what was happening. So I just want to do some background of New Jersey. New Jersey has adopted RCRA rules by reference, including the generator improvement rule, which Ross talked about. So we are seeing that a lot of cleanup sites are applying for being episodic, notifying us of episodic activity. So this is an option for sites that are really non-generators and are going to become large quantity generators because of a cleanup. The other thing I want to talk about also is that we do have a LSRP program. It's the Licensed Site Remediation Program in the state of New Jersey. It was adopted back in May 2009 from the Site Remediation Reform Act. So here in the state of New Jersey, since 2009, we all cleanup sites are being managed by LSRPs. Finally, we in the state of New Jersey, we don't run the corrective action program. The EPA does. Here in this region is Region 2. So any corrective action sites are permitted through EPA, not by New Jersey DEP. So I think that's a little bit of the background. All of these cases that I'm talking about are all piles, waste piles. The one that you see in the picture is actually from Inman Sports Club. So you can see it was a very large cleanup. They generated a lot of waste. But we'll talk about the substation. The reason the substation was going under construction was because of Superstorm Sandy. All the utility companies were trying to upgrade their substations, basically raising them up. So in this particular substation, it sat on a historic fill. So any type of construction work, excavation work, generated what could potentially have been a waste. When I got the inspection and when I went to the site, the foreman of the site indicated that they had piles of soil. That one was waste and one wasn't, but they don't know if it was hazardous waste. So like Ross has said in his slides, the waste determination is done at the point of generation. So in this case, PSE&G or in the substation were waiting until the pile was big enough so that they can then sample it. Our inspectors, including me, we sampled the pile there, and it fell for lead. So plus the pile was not even in area of contamination. So it was on a pile. It wasn't on a container, or in a building. There were large quantity generators of lead contaminated soil, D008 hazardous waste. So as per RCRA, the only way to accumulate waste in a pile, and also it was over 90 days, is by actually applying for and obtaining a permit from the department, RCRA permit. PSE&G responded to me regarding my determination that they were hazardous waste generators by saying that they were not generators of hazardous waste because they were going by the linear construction guidance provided by the Site Remediation Program within the state of New Jersey, Department of Environmental Protection. They were going along by that guidance that allowed them to stockpile the waste prior to testing it, and that they were undergoing remediation, and that RCRA didn't apply to them. So this is the pile. It wasn't a very large pile. Again, like Ross says, and this is one of the issues, is that even though it might have been covered at one point, as you see with some of the plastic sheeting on the ground, over time it because of wind, weather, is no longer covered. It was somewhat sitting on plastic. I'm not sure if it was all sitting on a plastic, but it was sitting on some kind of pavement because it was the parking lot in the back their substation. So we responded by saying that really it didn't apply. The linear construction technical guidance didn't apply because it wasn't a linear construction. It was a substation. And this was a traditional LSRP case and not at a construction project. Also in the state of New Jersey, when there's contamination found, they needed to report the contamination to our hotline. And that they're a generator. Everything applied to them as a RCRA generator, large quantity generator. A notice of violation was issued for failure to determine. I issued also that the containers were not in containers and that they did not submit a Part A, Part B permit application, RCRA permit. We did issue a penalty to them, which we subsequently settled with PSE&G. Ultimately, they did comply. They removed all the piles, and they continued to generate waste, but accumulating them in roll-offs. Case number 2 is Inman Sports Club, which was an old paint manufacturer. So we got a referral from our site remediation program that they were without notice excavating and removing all the paint waste that were dumped there by this paint manufacturer that was there back in the 50s and 60s. They excavated an extremely large area of their driving range. There were roll-off containers containing old paint drums and debris. But my main concern was the large soil pile that they generated. They did do analysis on this pile, and it fell for lead. So the biggest issue here was that the pile was so extremely large that it was not being covered. It was very close to other buildings that were owned by the Inman Sports Club, including an outdoor pool, which was very close to this. So most of the issues were not only that the pile, because of wind, was being carried, the soil was being wind blown towards the pool, and also, as you see on this slide, that the rain was washing away the soil that's been in a pile. So we issued a notice of violation for 265.31, which basically is that they failed to design, construct, maintain, operate a facility to minimize the possibility of release of the D008, the lead contaminated soil, to the surface that could have threatened the health and the environment. We also cited them because it was sitting there over 90 days. They didn't have a permit. This was a particularly high penalty. As I remembered, we actually did settle. It took them a while to remove the pile. It was one of those that I needed to go there on a weekly basis to make sure that the pile was gone. Again, this was prior to the LSRP program, but they had a memorandum of agreement with the department that they ultimately was terminated by the department because they did the excavation and the removal without their approval. Final case is Kramer Plating, and this was a actual generator inspection that I went to that consequently they were actually removing their soil piles from a former lagoon that they used, I guess, back in the 60s through 1980. From my investigation, I realized that also the site remediation program also knew that the lagoon was being excavated and stockpiled at the site, and that they were doing it without a licensed site remediation professional managing the site. So that was the beginning of the issue. Both piles that I saw were failed for cadmium, and they were sitting outside the area of contamination on bare ground, basically kind of in front of their building, which led to a body of water, which was it's a river down on the other side. So it was an issue. So this is one of the piles. As you see, it was just sitting on the bare ground. It was barely covered. So I issued a notice of violation. I again issued an NOV for 26531 and for not submitting a Part A, Part B permit application or RCRA permit. I guess the penalties here were settled pretty quickly after, and the removal of the pile was done pretty immediate after it was known that they couldn't do it. Ultimately, in all three cases, this would have been resolved by using containers or removing the waste, the soil, when excavated right into a truck, a dump truck, and removing the waste properly off site. And that's it. Again, these are cases that were resolved ultimately, but they could have been avoided if the consultant would have planned accordingly and known about their RCRA responsibilities. That's it.
Thanks, Martin.
Yep.
We've had a few questions come in through the question panel. If folks have other questions they'd like to ask, feel free to go ahead and post them now. I'll just take them in order. Question: what is meant by consolidation of a waste within an AOC if an AOC by definition must be an area of contiguous contamination?
Andy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so basically what EPA has said is, if you have an area of contamination and, for example, you want to consolidate waste within the AOC or just, what they call normal earth moving activities, that is what you can do within that's what they're talking about, what you can do within the AOC. So you can move it around just about any way you want or need to. Maybe to move it into a pile to make it amenable for live loading into a vehicle for removal off site. Maybe to install in situ remediation equipment, or change the grading of it to facilitate that, or facilitate the installation of a cover. Basically any of those types of things.
Thanks, Ross. Another question: do Superfund sites need a permit if they operated a waste pile? The situation they're asking about is very similar to Martin's case study number 1, except it was for a Superfund cleanup. And the questioner said, I think Superfund sites are exempt from RCRA permits, but I'm not 100% sure.
All right, I'm not an expert on this area, and if somebody's on the line that is and wants to chime in and correct what I may missay, please do so. But NPL sites do not have to obtain RCRA Part B permits. However, RCRA requirements are considered ARRs. I forget what ARR stands for at the moment. Applicable, relevant, something requirements, I forget. But at any rate, so you have to substantially comply with RCRA requirements, but you don't have to get the permit. And as you know, an MPL site goes through a very rigorous process for remedial project design. So it can be ensured that whatever activities that are occurring are done in compliance with RCRA requirements, and potentially that could mean use of a pile or use of other types of units that typically require a Part B permit.
Thanks, Ross. Another question, can a VSQG treat a hazardous waste to render it non-hazardous?
Okay, yeah, VSQGs, formerly known as CSQGs, are the least regulated category of hazardous waste generators, and they're also the smallest. So at the federal level, these are people that generate less than 220 pounds per month, and don't accumulate more than 1,000 kilograms, 2,200 pounds at any one time. Yes, they can engage in certain treatment activities. Their activities are pretty much not restricted the way other generators' activities are, except for really a very few things. They can send their waste basically to only certain types of facilities specified in the regulations. I will say, however, that some states are more stringent. Actually, I'll say many states are more stringent on this issue and could prohibit treatment by VSQGs.
Thanks, Ross. Another question. Do the RCRA requirements apply if cleanup is being conducted under CERCLA or a BCP program?
I'm sorry, what was the last one? A what CP?
BCP.
Oh, I think they meant PCB. Well, I think we've already answered the CERCLA question, because I think they're talking about NPL sites, Superfund sites. I don't think they're just talking about CERCLA listed sites. However, there are also CERCLA spill sites, and that's where the emergency permit comes in. I'm pretty sure somebody else on the line may be more aware of this than I am, but at a CERCLA spill response, I think that there's no exemption for RCRA requirements, and they would still have to comply with RCRA requirements. Sites being cleaned up under the TSCA program for PCBs, if there are, obviously with respect to the PCBs, they're subject to TSCA rules, and TSCA rules are very particular about how TSCA sites should be cleaned up. But if it's a site that's both a TSCA site and a RCRA site, in other words, if it has both TSCA and RCRA wastes, then you really have to comply with both sets of requirements.
Thank you. Another question, who defines the AOC, the facility or the regulators?
Well, there's not really assigned responsibility necessarily for either one. I guess the way I would put it is, if the facility or the remedial contractor defines an AOC a certain way, and again, the AOC is defined as a contiguous area of continuous contamination. It's pretty unambiguous. However, things can get a little gray when you have widely dispersed contamination that may be very, very low concentration at some places and very high concentrations at others. Some people may say it's all one big AOC. Some people may say, no, it's really 3 or 4 separate AOCs. But, I think ultimately, the rules don't specify who makes the determination, but I think reality is such that if a regulatory agency conducts an inspection and disagrees with the remedial project manager or the site owner or whatever, that about their definition of the AOC, and they think that it's multiple AOCs instead of one AOC, they could be subject to enforcement for that. Martin may want to weigh in on that issue.
I mean, I think the facility needs to provide that information to the regulator. I mean, and of course we need to verify ourselves, but in my experience, it's been always the facility. This is where the contamination is, not, you know, in our parking lot where I'm staging, where I'm putting my pile. So that's what I've seen. So for
Yeah,
me,
I would agree with,
it was an easy delineation. It was an easy line for enforcement, at least on the enforcement side of things.
I would agree with Martin, and I would say too, it depends on what the contaminants are too. So like if you've got an old plating site like Martin had, and you've got one area that has lots of chlorinated solvent contamination, and then another area that is not far away that has a lot of heavy metal contamination, you know, I would tend to look at those as separate AOCs because very quite obviously the source of the contamination was very different, you know, in those two sites. And I would agree also with Martin that it's really at a practical level up to the site owner, generator to make the determination as to where the AOC is, but realize that, you know, the regulators could be looking over their shoulder and asking questions.
Correct.
Thank you. And then a question for me on how do I find the slides from this presentation? So NEWMOA will be posting the slides along with the recording the beginning of next week, and we will send out a notice to all of the attendees about where to go about finding those on our site. Are there questions for our speakers today? No? Well, Ross and Martin, I just want to thank you again for taking time out to share your knowledge with us today and your experience, and a lot of great takeaways. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you,
And thanks to all of our attendees for being on the line today. Have a great rest of your day.